He wrote it for her. Every lyric, every note. It was her smile, her touch, her presence turned into melody. Annie's song was John Denver's way of saying what he couldn't say out loud anymore. That he still loved her, that he wanted her back. But by the time it hit the airwaves, it was already too late. Their marriage was unraveling. The same man who once made her feel like the center of his universe had become someone she barely recognized. To the world, the song sounded like a love story, but to Annie, it felt like a goodbye wrapped in music. And the heartbreak is, she never asked for the song. She just wanted her husband back. Before the fame, before the albums, before the heartbreak, there was just John and Annie. Two young dreamers, drawn to each other not because they had everything in common, but because they understood something unspoken in one another. He was a struggling folk singer living in Minneapolis, unsure if music would ever really work out. She was a secretary working for a local radio station, organized, steady, a calm force in his otherwise chaotic world. Their connection was immediate. It wasn't flashy or fast. It grew in the quiet moments. And when John proposed just a few months after they met in 1967, Annie said yes. Not to the idea of stardom, but to the man who played guitar on the floor of their tiny apartment. The man who believed he could move the world with his voice, even if the world hadn't started listening yet. They were young, in love, and poor. But Annie didn't care. She supported him emotionally and financially through the early years when the gigs were small and the paychecks smaller. And when John's career finally started to rise, first with Take Me Home, Country Roads, and then with a string of hits that turned him into a household name, he never stopped saying Annie was the reason he made it. But love, even the kind that feels fated, can buckle under pressure. And fame brought pressure in every direction. More touring, more interviews, more people telling John he was bigger than the marriage that had carried him here. Still, in the beginning, he tried to keep her close. He wrote about her constantly. Annie's song wasn't his first tribute, but it would become his most famous. And the way it came to him was almost surreal. One afternoon, after a terrible fight, John went for a solo ski in Aspen, where they lived at the time. He was spiraling, emotionally raw. But as he rode the lift through the mountains, something shifted. He looked out at the trees, the snow, the sky, and suddenly, the melody came pouring into his mind. A whole love song, in one rush. By the time he got home, he played it for her, told her it was hers, and for a while, it felt like a reset. Fans would later say it was the most beautiful love song ever written. Radio stations played it on repeat. Weddings used it as their first dance. But no one realized it had been born in the middle of a fight. And no one knew that Annie didn't hear the lyrics as a celebration. She heard them as a cry for help, because the man singing them was already slipping away, not just from her, but from himself. And once John crossed a certain line, the song couldn't bring him back. Success came faster than either of them expected. Within just a few years, John Denver had gone from playing small venues to performing in front of packed stadiums. He became one of the best-selling artists of the 1970s, with a voice that seemed to speak to an entire generation craving peace, nature, and something pure. But the more the world embraced him, the more distant he became from the woman he had written his most famous song for. Annie was still there. She was still showing up, attending events, smiling on the red carpet. But behind the scenes, she was watching her husband disappear into a life that no longer resembled the one they had built together. The simplicity they had shared in those early years, the tiny apartment, the handwritten songs, the evenings spent dreaming had been replaced by jet lag, entourages, interviews, and temptation. Fame didn't just change how others saw John, it changed how he saw himself. People called him a star. They told him he was special, untouchable. That kind of adoration is dangerous when you're already struggling to stay grounded. Annie, who had once been his anchor, now found herself competing with a version of John she didn't recognize. The man who had once needed her guidance, her presence, her steady hand, now seemed determined to prove he didn't need anyone at all. John was touring constantly. He began spending more time in Los Angeles and New York, while Annie stayed home in Aspen. They started living in different time zones, both literally and emotionally. And as the distance grew, the conversations turned cold. They argued more. They misunderstood each other more. Sometimes, they stopped speaking entirely. But to the outside world, none of that was visible. John still sang Annie's song with that same heartfelt intensity. Fans thought they were witnessing a fairy tale. They didn't know Annie was sitting backstage, sometimes crying through the applause. The turning point wasn't one single moment. It was a slow erosion, missed calls, canceled plans, small betrayals that added up to something neither of them could undo. And then came the rumors, whispers of infidelity, of late nights and new faces. Annie never spoke publicly about what she endured, but those close to her later said she was humiliated, blindsided by just how far things had drifted. John, for all his romantic songwriting, struggled to be the partner Annie needed in real life. He loved deeply, but he also battled insecurity, perfectionism, and an inner restlessness that no chart-topping song could settle. There's something especially cruel about watching someone sing a love song written for you while knowing the love itself is falling apart. And as the crowds got louder, Annie started to disappear from view. She stopped attending shows. She stopped answering calls. And eventually, she stopped waiting. John didn't see it right away. But when he finally did, the realization hit hard. Because no matter how many albums he sold, or how many fans stood on their feet when he hit the first note of Annie's song, there was one person who didn't hear it the same anymore. And she was the one it was written for. There's only so long two people can live in parallel before the distance turns permanent. And for John and Annie, that moment came quietly without a dramatic fight or a grand farewell. It came in pieces. A missed return flight, a birthday spent apart, a voicemail that went unanswered, then another, and another. By 1982, the cracks could no longer be disguised. They had already separated once before, but this time felt final. Annie filed for divorce. And the love story that had captured hearts around the world ended not with bitterness, but with silence. John tried to act like he understood, like he had seen it coming, but those close to him later said he was stunned, that somewhere deep down, he believed the song had been enough, that the gesture, the fame, the public devotion would keep her beside him. But Annie's song couldn't rewrite the reality they were living. It couldn't erase the late nights, the emotional distance, or the trust that had quietly faded. The music had always been his language. But by then, Annie had stopped listening. And what broke her wasn't the spotlight or even the infidelity rumors. It was the slow erosion of intimacy, the way he began treating strangers with more warmth than he gave her. The man who once noticed every little thing, the way she held her coffee, the sound of her laugh, had become someone who barely looked up when she walked into a room. In one of the most telling moments, friends said Annie once heard Annie's song playing in a store while shopping alone. No one recognized her. No one knew she was the woman behind the lyrics. And she didn't say a word. She just stood there, listening to a version of herself that had been captured in melody but lost in life. John never publicly blamed Annie. In interviews, he stayed vague, said they'd grown apart, said he wished her well, but in private, he carried the weight. He admitted to friends that he had taken her for granted, that he thought the love would survive just because the song had. And that was the part that hurt the most. He had written her the most beautiful words he could summon. He had shared them with the world, but he had stopped speaking directly to her long before the final chorus. There's a difference between being loved and being seen. Annie had been loved in a way most people never experience. But somewhere along the way, she stopped being seen. And for John, that realization didn't come until she was already gone from his life. He kept playing the song, night after night, venue after venue. Fans would stand and cheer, couples would hold hands, but John's eyes would sometimes shift just for a second, to a place far off stage, because the lyrics still belonged to her, even if she didn't belong to him anymore. And no matter how many times he sang it, the line he could never escape was the one that said it all. "You fill up my senses." And in the end, she had. Until she didn't. Annie Martel could have told her side. After all, she had lived through the whirlwind. She had watched the man she loved transform into a global sensation. She had endured the late nights, the loneliness, the betrayals that fans never saw. And yet, when the divorce became public, Annie said almost nothing. She never gave interviews, never wrote a memoir, never sat on talk shows recounting the highs and lows of being married to John Denver. And that silence became its own kind of story. Some assumed she was protecting him. Others believed she was protecting herself. But those who knew Annie best said the truth was simpler and far sadder. She had already said everything she needed to, just not in words. Annie was a private person. She hadn't married a celebrity. She had married a man with glasses, a guitar, and a dream. She wasn't drawn to the spotlight, and when it found her, she never quite adjusted. Even at the height of John's fame, Annie preferred the background. She was the calm beside the chaos, the steady voice behind the curtain. So, when the marriage fell apart, she chose the same quiet grace that had defined her all along. She didn't respond when tabloids published rumors about the reasons for their split. She didn't defend herself when strangers speculated about what kind of woman would leave a man who wrote Annie's song. And she didn't correct the myths fans began to build that she had given up on him, that she had turned cold. But privately, she grieved, not for the loss of fame or lifestyle, but for the version of John she had once known. The man who used to wake her with guitar chords and half-written lyrics. The one who would ask, "Does this sound like us?" before he ever recorded a line. She missed that man, even when he was still sleeping in the same house. In Aspen, where they had once built a home together, Annie stayed on. She remarried quietly years later, living a life far removed from the stage. Locals would still recognize her name, occasionally ask about the song, but Annie rarely engaged. She carried her past like a folded letter, always there, but no longer read aloud. And yet, the song never left her. How could it? It played on radios, in commercials, at weddings. It followed her through grocery stores and long drives. It was the melody of a marriage that had ended but never faded. And that, perhaps, was the most difficult part. Everyone else heard Annie's song as a timeless love story. But for her, it was a record of what once was and what could never be again. Still, she never asked him to stop playing it. Even after the divorce, even after years of distance, Annie never once demanded he retire the song that bore her name. She let him keep it. She let the world keep it. Because she understood something he hadn't, at least not until much later. A song can't hold a marriage together. It can echo the love, it can mourn the loss, but it can't change what's already broken. And though she never said those words out loud, John heard them anyway. Because every time he sang Annie's song after she was gone, his voice changed, just enough for her to hear the regret. John Denver continued to perform Annie's song for the rest of his life. No matter how many albums he released or causes he championed, no concert felt complete without it. It was always the centerpiece, the encore, the moment that drew standing ovations. But privately, the song became something else. It was no longer a declaration of love. It was an echo, a memory frozen in melody. And for John, it eventually carried more sorrow than celebration. Those close to him noticed the shift. His voice would soften when he reached the final chorus. His eyes would sometimes drift toward the floor. He never spoke about it publicly, but something had changed in how he carried the song. What once came from a place of joy now felt like a confession he kept having to relive. Because over time, John came to understand what he had really lost. It wasn't just Annie. It was the version of himself that existed when she believed in him. Before the chaos, before the distance, before the decisions he couldn't undo. He had chased success with everything he had, and he caught it. But in the process, he let go of the one person who had loved him before all of it, and he never fully forgave himself for that. There were attempts to rebuild. John and Annie maintained a civil relationship after their divorce. They spoke occasionally, shared quiet moments when paths crossed, but the closeness was gone. What remained was respect, and a strange kind of sorrow that didn't need to be spoken. Later in life, John entered new relationships. He remarried, tried again. But those who knew him best believed he never let go of Annie entirely. Not because he wanted her back, but because he knew what he had ruined. He once said that writing songs was how he made sense of things, but with Annie's song, he had done the opposite. He had painted a picture of love so perfect, so full of light and nature and joy, that it had blinded him to what was really happening, and that regret followed him long after the final performance. In the years before his death in 1997, John became more reflective. He spent more time in Colorado, more time alone, and though his public persona remained bright, his private writings, letters, journal entries, unreleased lyrics hinted at a man reckoning with his choices. He never blamed Annie. If anything, he honored her more as time passed. He spoke of her with softness, with care, with the kind of reverence that only comes when you realize you had something extraordinary and let it slip away. There is a haunting beauty in a love song that outlives the love itself. And for John Denver, that's exactly what Annie's song became. Not a plea to win her back, not a promise to change, but a memory set to music, a reminder of who he had been when he first wrote it, and who he never quite managed to become. In the end, he left behind millions of fans, dozens of hits, a legacy of peace and nature and harmony. But there was one lyric he never stopped returning to. You fill up my senses. Because even when the music faded and the crowd was gone, she still did. When John Denver's plane went down in 1997, the world mourned a voice that had defined an era. Tributes poured in from every corner. Fans played his music. Radio stations aired full-hour specials. And without fail, Annie's song was the one they chose to say goodbye. But for Annie, the loss was something quieter, more personal. She didn't step into the spotlight. She didn't give interviews. She didn't try to reshape the narrative. Instead, she let the world remember him the way they always had, gentle, smiling, full of song. What no one saw was the woman listening from a distance. The woman who had once been the muse, the partner, the first believer. The one he had written a masterpiece for, and the one he couldn't hold on to. And maybe that's why Annie's song still resonates after all these years. Because it holds more than love. It holds longing, regret, the ache of something beautiful that slipped through two people's hands. It was a gift to her, and a wound that never fully closed for him. And to this day, when that melody plays, it doesn't just fill up our senses. It reminds us of the one person who once did. For more emotional stories, check out this video.